Full disclosure, the voice you are listening to now is artificially generated, brought to you by satisphonic.com. See the link in the description for more details. What's the craziest WW2 fact that you know of? My all-time favorite WW2 story doesn't involve any violence or killing or destruction at all. Background: weather patterns in the northern hemisphere generally move west to east. As a result, the Germans were at a disadvantage in not knowing what weather was coming towards Germany because it was coming from the west, i.e., it was coming through areas controlled by the Allies. So they decided to secretly emplace an unmanned remote weather station on the coast of Canadian Labrador, which could send weather information to Germany by radio. Remember, no such thing as weather satellites back then. The weather station was emplaced by a U-boat in 1943. Since it was kind of hard to hide, although in a very remote area, the Germans put signs on it saying it belonged to the Canadian Weather Service. They also scattered empty packets of cigarettes around, so if anybody found it, they would assume it was an Allied military installation. It was eventually discovered by the Canadians. In fact, when it was discovered, the local people assumed it was exactly what the Germans had hoped them to think, that it was a Canadian military emplacement. It wasn't until 1981 that someone asked the Canadian military about their old weather station in Labrador, and the Canadian military said, "Ooh, that's not ours." Edit. Sorry, forgot the link. Weather station Kurt, Wikipedia. The Germans put signs on it saying it belonged to the Canadian Weather Service. It's actually funnier than that. From the article you linked, one canister was marked and misspelled Canadian Meteor Service in order to simulate Canadian Weather Service, as a German attempt to avoid suspicion if discovered. No such agency existed in Canada. In addition, the area was part of the Dominion of Newfoundland and was not part of Canada until 1949. Holy shit, it's at the War Museum in Ottawa. Next time I'm there, I got to see that. This is awesome. As it happens, I was perusing Canada on Google Earth last night, and the amount of wilderness in that country is mind-boggling. The way I look at it as a Canadian, there's two kinds of wilderness. The first kind is where, if you get lost, you can walk in any direction and eventually get out in a day or two. The other is the kind where, if you get lost, you can walk for the rest of your life and never see another person. And it's important to know which of the two you're getting into before going on that hike. Yep, I recall reading about it. However, if one is familiar with the coast of Labrador, it is no surprise it was not noticed. Desolate even today, it was extremely sparsely populated back then, and there were uncounted places to hide which had never had a human set foot upon them. Even today, I would suggest that the majority of the coastline of Labrador has never been walked. Imagine a freaking weather station being 4 times better at existing than the rest of your 1,000-year Reich. The nuclear attack on Nagasaki almost failed when the bomb plane got separated from their escorts, and they wasted 45 minutes of fuel trying to find them. Should also be noted the original target city was Kokura for the second bomb, but smoke from previous bombing runs fires and cloud cover they tried 3 times, but could not see their target. With fuel running low, they decided to proceed to pop target of Nagasaki, which also had increased cloud cover, but on the last pass before having to return to base, they had a just clear enough window to drop it. It still ended up 2 miles off course, and while still devastating, the natural hills protected a big chunk of the city. The first bomb dropped on Hiroshima was only off by 800 feet and absolutely decimated the city. Air defense over Japan was so weak that a bomber with the world's most valuable bomb could just fly around until it was out of fuel. The B-29 actually flew at an altitude that was high enough that fighters of the day were almost incapable of intercepting it because they couldn't fly fast enough at that altitude. Speed of piston engines fighters really falls off at altitude because you just cannot feed enough oxygen into the engine to generate power. Until they started adding superchargers, the P-51 could go way higher than a B-29. But the Japanese didn't really have the resources to keep up with the arms race. Their planes were outclassed by them. After Germany invaded France, they forced Citroën to make trucks for them. In an act of sabotage, Citroën moved the full mark on the engine oil dipstick lower, so the engines would run but fail under heavy use. Brilliant, brilliant. Similarly, when the guys in Seattle were building Me-262 jet replicas, they had some genuine parts to use as patterns. One guy told me he disassembled a nose gear leg to see its inner workings and found a deliberate machining fault that would have, with continued use, eventually worn through and collapsed the oleo, the forced labor machinists doing what little things they could get away with to show defiance. There's a story about an artillery shell landing right inside an Allied position and not exploding. Inside the shell was no explosive, only a note. This was all I could do. I recently saw a claim that this happened with anti-aircraft shells. The claim was that a bomber was hit 5 times in the fuel tanks. And when the shells were disassembled, they had notes in Czech saying, "This is all we can do for you now." Until they started adding superchargers, the P-51 could go way higher than a B-29. But the Japanese didn't really have the resources to keep up with the arms race. Their planes were outclassed by their... Oh shit, the engine on my truck blew up. What did you expect? They're French. My dad and his brother, Dan, ran into each other randomly in France. They turned around and saw each other, and they both yelled, "What are you doing here?" I have a couple of photos from that day. They got to spend that day together before going back into hell, and they both survived the war. Seeing someone you know from home while abroad in the military is a wild experience. I can't imagine seeing a brother in between trips through hell. I went to college with a guy who was a ranger, and his older brother was a SEAL. I remember him telling a story about securing a rooftop for a little bird to come land on, and one of the guys who got off was his brother. Pretty more likely since it's a smaller theater and they're both special forces, but still cool. This is so fucking awesome. In France, my Uncle Curtis got blown up but still alive, so they morphined him really good and buried him in the sand till the battle moved on. Then they came back and got him. He's still kicking. Here's an article about him. Hups, World War Con live 201,209,209 tying by wheel, black stank, battle height. Holy shit, I've never heard that, but it makes sense. The beaches were hell zones, no cover. Might as well bury him and hope we get back before high tide. Holy shit, I was thinking, bury him and hope you get back before he's been shot or bombed again. But high tide, wouldn't that be a new hell, waiting injured in the sand as the water rises up past your ears? If it's any consolation with the morphine they gave, he was either unconscious or didn't get. Uncle Curtis is a badass. Cheers to him. Something tells me Uncle Curtis didn't have a whole lot of say in the matter and probably, hopefully, wasn't conscious. That time, the British dumped a dead man's body with fake plans planted on him so it would wash up in Spain and get turned over to the German. Operation Mincemeat for anyone that wants to learn more. Unbelievably meticulous. There is even a Netflix movie that stars Colin Firth and Matthew McFadden that is quite good trivia. They both previously played the same character, Mr. Darcy, from different versions of Pride, Prejudice, and star together for the first time here. It's insane that homeless dude died destitute without ever knowing the role he played in history. That's so nuts to think about. Nobody did secret agent stuff like the British. They were absolute masters of deception. The British discovered radar, which was helping them kick ass in the air during nighttime, and they didn't want anyone to know. So they just told everyone that their pilots were eating carrots. The best radar story during the war was the night action of the Battle of Cape Matapan. The entire British Mediterranean fleet, including an aircraft carrier, managed to sneak up to the Italian fleet during the night and open fire at an unsuspecting opponent at a range of 3,000 yards. "If you stay here much longer, you will go home with slitty eyes," said to 21-year-old British student Simon Kirby during a visit to China in 1986. And when the Germans successfully jammed radar, they kept transmitting as if it was still working, so the Germans did not know they had succeeded. Wouldn't they have known from the increased number of returning airplanes? That's not accurate. The Germans, Americans, and British all had functional radar systems at the outset of WW2. The Soviets and Japanese were working on them too. These radar systems were employed on ground, on ships, and on some aircraft. What the British had developed was the cavity magnetron, a secret that they shared with the user but desperately wanted to keep secret from the German. The cavity magnetron allowed for the manufacture of radar systems that operated at a much higher power and frequency and occupied a much smaller footprint. This allowed naval vessels to acquire targets and hit them with only a radar signature, blind fire, and allowed for night fighters to acquire enemy aircraft at night and from above. The British mounted air search radar sets on some heavy fighters and used them to defend the English Channel and Great Britain against the Luftwaffe. The British had an early warning system that the Germans knew about but were unable to defeat. This would allow RAF fighters to get into the vicinity of the attacking Luftwaffe, but the Germans knew about this and anticipated it, so they would attack at night when aircraft would be harder to spot in the night sky. What the Germans didn't know is that the British had developed accurate air search radar mounted on some fighters. The fighters could individually see the Luftwaffe aircraft and approach from above behind as appropriate. The myth that carrots gave their pilots good eyesight was spread as a rumor to explain how RAF pilots were basically wall hacking. There was a Spanish guy who wanted to be a spy for the UK, but they said no. He went to Portugal and convinced the Germans that he could spy for them and pretended to be in London with a whole fake spy network. He gave them fake info based on newspapers and tourist guides, and the Germans kept giving him money to pay his fake people. Whenever the Germans got mad that his info was wrong, he blamed one of his fake spies and had them killed. The British had a choice but to make him one of their agents. He was so good at fooling the Germans. But really, the Nazis were just absolute imbeciles at deception. That Hitler only joined the Nazi party because the German army sent him to a meeting to basically spy on them. Someone was giving a speech suggesting Bavaria should leave Germany and join Austria. Hitler was enraged by this and went on a rant about why that was a bad idea. The other members were impressed and recruited him to join the party, and the rest is history. He also quickly realized how valuable he was to them because of his oratory skills and charisma. He was an outstanding recruiter. So, at one point, he threatened to leave and join another party if he wasn't given leadership. They had no choice. Hitler wasn't just some dude who happened to be at the head of the Nazis. He really was a huge part of the reason everything happened as an individual. Ian Kershaw's biographies of Hitler are really great, as well as Richard Evans' Third Reich trilogy, although that's more about Nazi Germany as a whole rather than just Hitler for anyone interested. Of course, Hitler is one of the most written about subjects in history, so there's countless books. Those are just ones I think highly of. The British had the entire German espionage system corrupted and controlled from the top down. Any time a German spy would get dropped into England, MI6 agents threw them into the nearest safe house, presumably put a gun to their head while talking sweetly about how, if the spy played along, transmitted back what the Brits wanted them to say, they'd be okay. They also loved their bullshit puns and bad humor. Their double agent program, Double Cross, was labeled as X. A member of the US Navy survived being stabbed 4 times by Japanese bayonets during the Battalion Death March when he was a POW in the Philippines. He buried a spoon in the ground before the march started that he promised he'd come back and retrieve when the war was over to prove he survived. In 1946, he returned to the Philippines and dug up the spoon to bring home. That man was my great-uncle, and my family still has that spoon 82 years later. Not the most crazy fact, but it's one that's personal to my family. Wholesome story. TB was a death sentence back then. Soldiers who got it were sent back to the States to TB wards where most died. My grandfather, a southern man, was stationed on a boat in the South Pacific, contracted TB, and was sent to a TB ward in Boston. He watched man after man die. One day a doctor announced to the ward that they were looking for volunteers for a medical experiment. He and one other guy volunteered and lived. The rest died. The experiment was heavy-duty antibiotics. During his recovery, he met a young female nurse, fell in love, married her, and moved to May. They had 7 kids. I am the oldest of all the grandkids. Fast forward many decades, and my daughter contracted aviary TB. She was treated with Cipro, a high-dose antibiotic derived from the same treatment my grandfather went through all those years ago, and it saved her life. Not sure it's so crazy as opposed to just a tragic facepalm, but the life jackets given to men on some amphibious landings, such AD day, were basically little round floated. They were supposed to be attached and set under the arms, but due to all the equipment the soldiers were wearing, it was difficult and uncomfortable to do that. So, they attached them around the waist instead. When they went into the water, they were so top-heavy that the lifebelt would end up flipping them over. They'd drown with their feet in the air, unable to right themselves. Also, this is one fact that I like. Raising goats became a big cottage industry because they needed to feed the Indian soldiers who would not eat beef or horse. The initial request for 7,000 goats for food for the arriving Indian soldiers confounded the military officer who received it. I remember someone once posting an anecdote about their great-uncle during WW2, a Midwestern farmer boy who couldn't swim, who naturally spent the entire war in the Navy serving on boats and submarines. Always had his life jacket by his side, but never used it. After the war ended and he was discharged and on shore for good, he tossed his life jacket overboard at a dock and watched as it promptly sank like a stone. The United States had 2 freshwater aircraft carriers. The atomic bomb was the second most expensive project of YE. The most expensive project of WE was the B-29 bomber used to drop the atomic bomb. And the Soviets stole it. 3 B-29s landed at Vladivostok after bombing Japan. The USA, being neutral in the Pacific War, impounded them and detained the crews before quietly slipping them to the Americans on the land. Les Roux. In a top-secret program, Stalin told the aircraft designer Tupolev, who had just been released from a gulag, to reverse engineer the planes under the supervision of the Nankfeld. Beria, world-renowned cunt, said that if anything was altered or compromised from the original design, the design teams would be shot. The American planes were made to imperial measurements, and the Soviets only had access to manufacturing in metric, so the metals were slightly different thicknesses. To cover this, and it seemed like they were absolutely identical, the design team included battle damage and matched the internal color scheme by inventing a new type of paint in the right color. It worked, and the Tupolev 4, the US's first intercontinental bomber, was unveiled at the May Day March of 1947 when 4 Tu-4s flew over, thus proving they weren't the detained B-29s. I think the construction of the Alaska Highway is underrated and less known than it should be. The US connected mainland us to Alaska via northern Canada by building 2,000 km of road through previously wild land. Camps of engineers and laborers built this 2,000 km of highway through the Yukon in just about 8 months. That is an insane pace, cutting through swamps, forests, etc., working at 40s Gatian, just an unprecedented pace of construction, the likes of which we will not see again. It's a great example of the war being won, not only through combat, but through material. Great video here. Tips. Would YouTube watch with double castle of Osnid. Bear with me on this one. In 1942, a company of Polish troops were evacuated from the Soviet Union and found their way to Iran. Along the way, they befriended a Syrian brown bear that they named Wojtek. They officially enlisted him as a private in the unit. The men ended up in Italy from 1943-44, bringing the bear along with them. It helped to carry heavy ammunition and quickly became a celebrity among the troops. Wojtek was eventually discharged after the war and lived peacefully in Edinburgh Zoo until he passed away in 1963. Don't forget that they paid him in cigarettes, and his army buddies would come visit him at the zoo. As much as I love the mental image of a bear smoking a cigarette, I think he just ate them. A French-Canadian soldier named Leo Major was so pissed off at the Germans for killing one of his friends, he single-handedly rounded up 93 Germans and liberated a Dutch town. He kept bringing back prisoners, grabbed some ammo, and went back, alone, to capture more. He also only had one eye. When he was to be awarded the Legion of Merit Medal, he refused because the officer who recommended him wasn't a Canadian. During the war, Canada built more military trucks than the major Axis powers, Germany, Japan, Italy, combined. Source: the mighty and technologically unparalleled German army was mostly supplied by horse-drawn wagons, and that was after stealing every car and truck in the occupied country. Hitler invaded Russia with more horses than Napoleon. Something like 1/10 of the Russian population died, more like 1/7, and it was not uniformly distributed. It is estimated that around 80% of Soviet males born in 1923 did not survive World War I. Even worse in Poland, 21% of the entire population died. Joe Medicine Crow, the last war chief of the Crow Nation. During WW2, he completed all 4 tasks required to be a war chief: touching an enemy without killing him, taking an enemy's weapon, leading a successful war party, and stealing an enemy's horse. He led a successful war party and stole 50 horses owned by the Waffen-SEs from a German camp, singing a traditional Crow honor song as he rode off, awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and Bronze Star. Went on to be a tribal spokesman and obviously the Crow Nation war chief until his death in 2016. If Tyler Sheridan needs a new Western war show idea, this is it. Hot tips, and Wikipedia or Wikijoe medicine. I watched a documentary of a guy who wanted to be a spy and ended up somehow getting one of the highest medals on the German side and one of the highest medals in the Allied side also. Supposedly the only person to do so. Codename Garbo. He was just a guy who wanted to be a spy, so he offered me 6 services and was turned down. So he started spying for the Germans and feeding them false intel to prove to the British he could do it. The 8th Air Force suffered more casualties than the Marine Corps. Codename Garbo. He was just a guy who wanted to be a spy, so he offered me 6 services and was turned down, so he started spying for the Germans and feeding them false intel to prove to the British he could do it. That the American superweapon to end the war could have used bats with incendiary bombs glued to them. Little S. Adams was a dental surgeon from Pennsylvania who had become fascinated by bats on a trip to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico in 1942. He was intrigued by their strength and their habit of roosting before dawn. He also knew that most Japanese buildings were made of wood instead of concrete, making them highly flammable. Thus, an idea started to emerge. If time-release incendiary bombs could be strapped to a large number of bats, a bat bomb could be released over a Japanese city at night, allowing the bats to spread out all over the city and roost before sunrise. Then the incendiary bombs would go off, and the fires would be able to spread quickly over a large area. Using his connections, Adams was an acquaintance of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. His plan was approved by President Roosevelt after some advice from Harvard zoologist Donald Griffith. The president's opinion was, "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but is worth looking into." The project was placed under the U.S. Army Air Force. Originally, the incendiary bombs would have been made with white phosphorus, but the design changed to use a new flammable invention, napalm. Mexican free-tailed bats were harvested from the wild with permission from the National Park Service, and the tiny bombs were attached to the bats with an adhesive. Testing did not go well at first. In 1943, armed bats were accidentally released onto the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Air Base. The bats roosted under a fuel tank and incinerated the test range. The project was relegated to the U.S. Navy in August 1943, who renamed it Project X-Ray and then passed it on to the U.S. Marines that December. The definitive test of the weapon happened at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah, where a mock-up of a Japanese village was burned to test its effectiveness. Results were optimistic, an observer commenting that the bat power delivery system was more effective than conventional napalm bomb. To quote the report, expressed in another way, the regular bombs would give probably 167 to 400 fires per bomb load, where X-ray would give 3,625 to 4,725 to 4,748 fires. The project was cancelled when it was revealed that the weapon wouldn't be truly ready until mid-1945. In a search for a quick end to the war, attention focused on the atomic bomb project, which was showing quicker results. German and American soldiers fought alongside French prisoners against the S during the last days of the war, the Battle of Castle Itter Edit. If I had a nickel for every time the Wehrmacht and the Americans teamed up against the S during World War II, I have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. After the annexation of Austria to Nazi Germany in 1938, the Lipizzaner breeding mares of the Spanish riding school in Vienna were transferred to an experimental farm in the town of Hostow in Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia. The goal was to create a race of Aryan horses. The first sentence of Operation Cowboy sounds like a random word generator. The last Japanese soldiers didn't surrender until the mid-1970s. Ets en Wikipedia, Oguikihiru Onoda. They tried to make an aircraft carrier made of ice, technically picrete, sawdust or wood pulp and ice. During the Battle of Samar, a part of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a small task force of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, codenamed Taffy 3, were attacked by the Japanese Center Fleet, which consisted of 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. This was the only time the battleship Yamato engaged enemy surface vessels. The battle was absurdly one-sided for the Japanese. The battleship Yamato alone had a higher displacement than all of Taffy 3 combined. After a long battle against absolutely stacked odds, the small American task force managed to force the Center Fleet to retreat and saved all the vulnerable landing craft of the Leyte Gulf invasion. If they made a movie out of it, no one would believe it. The bombers launched every piece of ordnance they had, and when they ran out of those, they'd make fake attack runs and strafe the ships with gunfire. The ship's gunners throwing every type of shell they had, even the air illumination shells. The engineers bypassing the safeties on the boilers to get the ship to go as fast as possible. Those ships didn't just save the landing beaches and the escort carriers. They straight up earned a tactical victory. Just look at the ships sunk and the casualties. It's just insane that it actually happened. Simo Haya Aka Akai, the White Death, was a Finnish sniper with 505 confirmed kills in less than 100 days, mind you. He did not use a scope, plain old iron sights. First, the scopes would fog up in the cold air, and second, a glint of it would give his position away. Not only that, he would stuff snow into his mouth and keep close to banks to prevent his breath from misting in the air and betraying his location. These were heavily packed in to prevent snow from billowing upwards when he fired. He kept a personal diary called a sin list, which he wrote all of his kills in as a form of repentance for his action. It tallies kills from his actions, which he didn't commit but still felt responsible for. He was an avid hunter as a lad and a keen marksman with many trophies. His hunting gave him fantastic wilderness skills in both rationing and manual orienteering. Combined with the fact he was accurate in estimating distances of up to 150 meters to an accuracy of a meter, his personal skill set was perfect for allowing him to achieve what he did. The Soviets were so terrified of this man that they ended basically stacking the odds in a numbers game through explosive ordnance. When he was finally wounded by a round, he was presumed dead and placed with other corpses. About a week later, he woke up. He read his own obituary in a newspaper and simply wrote a letter to tell them they were misinformed. The British used inflatable tanks to trick the enemy. The Purple Heart medals that the United States awards to its wounded soldiers today were minted in preparation for the anticipated massive casualties that would result from a land invasion of Japan. ATA. Apparently I'm wrong, and the last of those YE-era medals were handed out in 2000 or 2010 or thereabouts. Thanks to several commenters for the correction. Itatu, per 102. Maybe I was right the first time. That is insane to me. They were expecting so many to die that we're still using them today. Pretty sobering thought. Ice cream ships. The US built concrete barges and added ice cream parlors on them for war in the Pacific. The idea was these barges could be towed to various harbors and sued to serve ice cream to any forces stationed there. Navy, Marines, Army, Air Force, etc. Depending on the source, between one and many of these were built. Some may have been in converted merchant ships or older warships, but at least one was a concrete barge. This was because the US High Command considered ice cream essential for our soldiers' morale. To that point, until the boats, called godunks, were built, crafty airmen would load up milk and sugar in cleaned-out cans and take them to high altitude and do crazy maneuvers to shake them. But imagine that every other nation struggled with getting rations and bullets in enough numbers to the troops. Many Germans lacked winter clothing, many Russians lacked boots, and the Italians often lacked everything. After Dunkirk, the English trained troops with brooms because they didn't have enough rifles. Japan almost always had their soldiers marching with no rations and expected them to eat to the land. And the US spent millions of dollars ensuring our troops in the tropics had fucking ice cream. They said, well, if we can't ship it, we'll make it there. And then we went and did that. How demoralizing could that be? You're hungry, out of ammo, down hundreds of soldiers in your unit, and there's no real hope of resupply, and there's some Americans lining up for ice cream. They not only have enough money and equipment to basically fire off ammo all day, call in airstrikes every time the jungle sneezes, and have daily reinforcements, but they also have enough money and material to go and give every soldier a cone stuffed with chocolate ice cream with sprinkles. I don't know if this is true, but I heard this once. Supposedly at some point in the European theater, a German unit pushed back an American unit and took over their campsite. Most of the German soldiers were having a great time eating the American supplies, including a chocolate cake. However, the officer kept looking at that cake and seeing it as a sign that they had already lost the war. Their soldiers were on reduced rations in their own home territory, and the Americans, whose supply lines started on a different continent, were getting chocolate birthday cakes to their soldiers at the front lines. Logistics wins wars. Audie Murphy. Just Google him. There are too many stories to pick just one. Dude was basically the playable character in a Call of Duty game, and played himself in a movie about him during WW2. The atrocities of Unit 731, and that those involved never got the punishment they deserved. That, after victory in Europe, General Patton had a grand master plan in mind to acquire what was left of the German army and together take out the Soviet Union while they were weak. Edit. Depending on the source, some say he just wanted to use them to push the Soviets back out of Europe, restoring it to its pre-war borders.